weather news? どんなんでしたっけ?
Okay, picture this. The Pacific War, right? You might immediately think massive naval battles, island invasions, but what if I told you one of the key, surprising tactics early on involved soldiers on bicycles?
It sounds almost unbelievable, doesn't it? But that detail points to a much larger story, the complex blend of strategy, desperation, and, unexpected turns that define the Pacific conflict.
And that's exactly what we're taking a deep dive into today. A listener shared source material, specifically a transcript from a pretty detailed video presentation that walks us through this war from its really tense origins all the way to its, well, agonizing end.
Yeah, this source material gives us a fantastic look not just at what happened, but really gets into the why. It digs into the critical decisions, the motivations behind them, sometimes the unintended consequences, and the sheer human cost involved.
Right. So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack all of that. We want to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, those surprising facts like the bicycles, and the critical insights. What were the real turning points? What drove the leaders? And maybe most critically, why, once it kicked off, was this war just so incredibly difficult to stop?
Exactly. It's about looking beyond the big battles and understanding the intricate forces, political, military, cultural, even technological, that shaped this entire period.
Okay, let's get into it. And to understand where the Pacific War came from, you really have to start in China.
Absolutely. The source reminds us that for a long time, going way back to the Qing dynasty, Western powers had been, let's say, leveraging significant advantages in China's spheres of influence, getting access to resources on pretty preferential terms.
Right, but Japan's move felt different, didn't it? When they took steps to effectively monopolize Manchuria, especially after fighting a major war there, powers like the US and the UK, they saw it as crossing a line. It was like, okay, this is going too far. That seems to have been the reaction.
And that reaction wasn't just, diplomatic notes. The source details, the concrete steps they took. The U.S. stopped exporting vital materials like iron and steel to Japan. That was a major economic pressure point. And the UK started sending military aid, actual weapons, to China.
So Japan, which had initially felt pretty confident it could handle just China, suddenly found itself facing, well, opposition and actual support for China from major Western powers. This created a real bind for them.
And then the U.S. laid out these really explicit demands for lifting those sanctions. Japan had to return Manchuria, pull all its troops out of China proper, and crucially, allow equal trade access for all nations in China, not just keep their own dominance.
Yeah, and the source explains Japan's dilemma perfectly here, particularly for the military leadership. Withdrawing from Manchuria, that felt abandoning this massive investment in resources, effort, and the lives lost securing it. It was just unacceptable to them.
So they saw themselves facing this terrible choice. Either capitulate, give up everything they'd fought for and gained in China, or escalate, go to total war with the Western powers, specifically the United States. The source makes it pretty clear that Japan ultimately chose total war with the West, driven directly by this perceived impasse over China. That decision, rooted right there in China, is really the genesis of the Pacific War.
And once that decision was made, the sheer geography of the Pacific Ocean just became the dominant factor, didn't it? You're talking thousands upon thousands of miles separating Japan and the U.S. Any conflict was fundamentally going to be naval. Sea power was everything.
Right. And many of the Japanese military initially favored a more, let's say, conventional approach, a drawn-out war, gradually wearing down the U.S. fleet, aiming for some big showdown closer to Japan, later on.
But the source introduces Admiral Yamamoto's really radical alternative. He proposed a super short-term decisive battle. The thinking was, look, Japan couldn't possibly win a long war against the industrial might of the U.S. It just wasn't feasible. Their only hope, as he saw it, was a knockout blow right at the beginning. Force a quick, favorable peace treaty before the U.S. could fully mobilize its power.
And his target for this incredibly audacious opening move, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii.
Why Pearl Harbor? Well, the source lays it out clearly. It was the absolute heart of the U.S. Pacific Fleet's forward operations. It had all the critical infrastructure, the ship repair facilities, the airfields, those vast fuel storage tanks.
Exactly. Crippling Pearl Harbor would push the U.S. fleet's base of operations thousands of miles back, all the way to the U.S. mainland. That would make it incredibly difficult for them to project power anywhere near Japan.
And beyond just the physical objective, Yamamoto had a clear psychological goal too. Attacking U.S. territory, Hawaii, I mean, remote as it was still American soil. He hoped maybe it would make the war feel personal to the American public.
Yeah, the idea was previous U.S. conflicts felt distant, right? Europe, China. By bringing the war literally home, he aimed to kind of shock Americans into an anti-war sentiment. He believed they wouldn't tolerate the casualties and the risk.
So the attack happened, launched preemptively, total surprise, achieved significant tactical success initially, damaging or sinking many U.S. battleships. The Japanese attack force returned with minimal losses. Initial reports must have felt like a huge success.
But, and this is crucial, the source points out the critical failures, the things they didn't hit. Most importantly, the ship repair docks and those absolutely vital fuel tanks at Pearl Harbor were left largely intact.
Which meant
the base, while damaged, could still function. It could still be repaired and supplied. Yamamoto's goal of thorough destruction just wasn't achieved.
And the source explains this failure, partly, stemmed from Yamamoto's bold strategic vision not being fully understood or maybe embraced by everyone down the chain of command.
Right. Many commanders were still kind of stuck in the mindset of older wars, like the Russo-Japanese War. They were thinking in terms of attrition, gradually weakening the enemy. They saw Pearl Harbor as just the first step in a long war, not the decisive war-ending blow Yamamoto envisioned.
So the fleet commander on the scene, maybe not fully grasping Yamamoto's strategic intent, became overly cautious.
Yeah, he feared a counterattack if they lingered too long. So he ordered the withdrawal after the first wave, leaving those critical repair facilities and all that fuel untouched. A decision with massive long-term consequences.
And the unforeseen outcome for Yamamoto's psychological gamble, exactly the opposite of what he intended.
Totally. Instead of creating anti-war sentiment, President Roosevelt seized the moment. The source described how, remember, Pearl Harbor became this powerful rallying cry. The attack united the American public, transforming the conflict into a total war, requiring this massive national effort. Precisely the kind of long war Yamamoto knew Japan couldn't win.
Okay, so with that initial strike delivered, Japan immediately pivoted its attention south. What was the driving motive there?
Resources. Simple as that. Japan is an island nation, very limited natural resources. They desperately needed things like iron ore, rubber, and especially oil, which were abundant in Southeast Asia.
This was a huge risk, though, wasn't it? Attacking Southeast Asia meant attacking colonies of major European powers, the UK, the US, and the Philippines, France, the Netherlands.
It meant picking a fight with multiple established global powers all at once, a huge gamble.
But the potential payoff in resources, particularly in areas like Thailand and Malaya mentioned in the source, must have seemed too great to ignore.
Exactly. And this brings us back to that fascinating detail you mentioned right at the start, the Jinren Butai, the bicycle infantry.
Right, the bicycles. It just sounds so low-tech for a modern war.
It does. But the source explains the strategic rationale really well. Japan actually had resource shortages for its own military, including limited numbers of trucks and cars. Bicycles were easier for them to produce domestically, and, crucially, they were already widely imported and popular in Southeast Asia. Often durable, Japanese-made models, perfect for the region's often poor roads.
So how did they use them?
The method was simple, but incredibly effective. Soldiers used the bikes for speed on roads, but then they'd carry them across difficult terrain, like swamps or rivers. The source highlights this gave them drastic speed of advance, unbelievably fast.
And the impact was huge, particularly in the Malaya campaign. This unexpected speed just completely overwhelmed the British defenders. They couldn't establish continuous defensive lines because the Japanese forces were just moving too fast, bypassing strong points.
Yeah, it led to the swift British surrender and Japan securing those vital resources in Malaya, a major early success story, really driven by these unconventional tactics.
Does the source say how they got all those bikes?
It touches on that. Military reports use the term chistatsu, which kind of implies forced requisition, taking them. However, it also notes that in some areas, local populations, perhaps seeing the Japanese as potential liberators from European colonial rule, might have voluntarily provided assistance, including bikes. So it's a little ambiguous in the reporting.
Okay, so while Japan was rapidly expanding south, the U.S. wasn't just sitting completely idle. Even after the shock of Pearl Harbor, what was their initial response?
Well, their initial response included what the source calls harassment attacks. Pretty clever, actually. They'd launch long-range bombers from distant island bases, fly them to Japanese outposts, drop just a few bombs, and get out fast. It minimized the risk to their own planes and crews.
So not much physical damage then.
No, honestly, minimal physical damage. But the real objective, the source explains, was psychological. Specifically, boosting morale back home in the U.S. These low-risk missions were reported as significant victories in U.S. news and radio. American forces attacking Japanese bases, returning unscathed, big morale booster.
And why was this psychological game so critical at that point?
Because this was total war. Modern conflict requires the entire nation's effort. Civilians in factories build the weapons, farmers grow the food. The military relies completely on that domestic support structure.
Right.
And there was a real fear that if the public only heard bad news, Pearl Harbor, other early defeats, that anti-war sentiment could grow, leading to strikes, opposition, maybe crippling the whole war effort. So those small reported victories were essential propaganda, really, to counteract that fear and maintain civilian support.
Then came something much more direct, a bigger psychological blow. The Doolittle Raid.
Ah, yes, the Doolittle Raid. Incredibly daring, bombing the Japanese mainland itself. It was really difficult because B-25 bombers weren't designed to take off from aircraft carriers. It required major modifications and immense courage from the crews.
What about the damage? Was it significant?
Physically? No, the damage from the Doolittle Raid was pretty limited. The planes were stripped down to maximize range, meaning they carried very few bombs. But the psychological impact on Japan was immense, huge. Before the raid, the war felt far away from most Japanese civilians. After the raid, suddenly the homeland itself felt vulnerable.
So from Japan's perspective, this raid forced them to seriously consider mainland defense. It proved the U.S. could reach them.
Exactly. And for the U.S., the goal was multifaceted. Check Japan's expansionist momentum, provide another big morale boost at home, and potentially plant seeds of doubt in the Japanese civilian will, which, as we know, was absolutely essential for their total war effort.
And that threat to the mainland, really highlighted by the Doolittle Raid, directly led Japan to plan its next major operation, right? Midway.
Precisely. Japan's primary goal at Midway was to finally destroy the remaining U.S. aircraft carriers. They rightly saw them as the source of the Doolittle Raid and the main threat to their security. So the plan was attack Midway Island, a vital strategic island near Hawaii, to lure out the U.S. carrier fleet for a decisive battle they expected to win.
Meanwhile, the U.S. was still scrambling, recovering from Pearl Harbor, frantically repairing carriers, but Midway was absolutely essential. It was the last stepping stone before Hawaii itself. They had to commit everything they had.
And the source emphasizes the absolute #1 critical factor at Midway: U.S. code breaking. The U.S. had successfully broken the main Japanese naval codes. They knew the entire plan for Midway, the target, the timing, the Japanese force composition, their movements, everything.
Wow, and Japan?
Japan, on the other hand, went into this operation almost completely blind regarding U.S. movements. Their scout planes were limited, patrols weren't effective, and they were totally unaware the U.S. fleet was already waiting for them, perfectly positioned based on that intercepted intelligence.
This source also mentions other issues for Japan, right? Overconfidence, command problems.
Yeah, definitely. Japanese overconfidence played a role, expecting another easy victory like Pearl Harbor. And there was internal debate and confusion on the Japanese carriers right before the battle. Should they rearm planes with bombs for ground targets on Midway, or with torpedoes for enemy ships? This led to critical delays, wasting precious time changing bomb types, planes crowded on the decks.
And that's when the Americans hit them.
Exactly. Disaster struck at the worst possible moment. U.S. dive bombers arrived and hit the Japanese carriers precisely when they were most vulnerable, planes lined up, being rearmed, refueled, bombs lying around. Just a few hits caused massive, uncontrollable fires, leading to the catastrophic loss of 4 major Japanese carriers in a matter of hours.
Devastating.
Absolutely devastating. Japan lost not just the ships, but hundreds of irreplaceable aircraft and, crucially, their most experienced naval aviators. The U.S. lost 1 carrier. Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War. It crippled Japan's offensive naval power and permanently shifted the strategic initiative to the U.S.
So, with their main offensive naval strength pretty much broken at Midway, Japan was forced onto the defensive, wasn't it? A war of attrition. And the focus shifted to these brutal island-by-island battles, starting notably with Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands.
Yeah, Guadalcanal was strategically important because of its location. It was a stepping stone for the U.S., it pointed towards Australia and eventually the Philippines. For Japan, it was part of their outer defensive perimeter. Japan actually landed first, unopposed initially, started building an airfield. They seemed to underestimate how quickly the U.S. would react, especially after the Midway victory.
That was a miscalculation.
Big time. The U.S. counterattack came quickly. U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal. Initially, they encountered mostly Japanese engineers and construction personnel, not frontline combat troops. So the Marines quickly secured the island and that vital airfield.
How did Japan react to that?
They realized pretty quickly how important the island was and launched a costly, prolonged effort to retake it. They started pouring in troops and resources, despite facing severe logistical challenges getting them there. This turned into a brutal 6-month slugfest on land and sea.
Now, the source mentions one area where Japan did have an advantage, at least initially, was in the naval battles around the island, particularly at night, their yasen.
Right, the night battles. They were incredibly skilled at it. The source mentions their intense training, their skill in night navigation, and their very effective use of torpedoes, especially the long-lance torpedo. U.S. sailors were often caught completely off guard by these night actions. They even called the Japanese sailors cat's eyes because of their perceived ability to see in the dark.
But despite those naval successes at night,
despite some real successes in those naval skirmishes, damaging quite a few U.S. ships, Japan ultimately failed to retake Guadalcanal. The land fighting was horrific, and the Japanese forces suffered crippling supply shortages. The source mentions they were forced to use smaller ships, destroyers mostly, for transport runs the Tokyo Express because they lacked larger transports or couldn't risk them. And even those were constantly harassed and sunk by the U.S.
So after 6 months?
After 6 months of relentless, incredibly costly fighting and accumulating losses, Japan finally ordered a withdrawal from Guadalcanal. It was another significant defeat that severely depleted their already strained resources and manpower. Many wounded were tragically left behind.
So losses are mounting midway, Guadalcanal. Japan is clearly being pushed back. What happens next strategically?
Well, as these losses mounted and their outer island defenses started crumbling, Japan was forced into a strategic contraction. They just couldn't hold everything. They had to abandon many of those distant island bases to consolidate their remaining forces closer to home.
And this led to establishing a specific defense line.
Exactly. This led to the establishment of what the source calls the Absolute National Defense Zone. And this wasn't just some arbitrary line on a map. It was a perimeter defined by a very practical reality. The range of U.S. bombers, specifically the new B-29s, stretching roughly from Myanmar in the west across to the Kuril Islands in the north, losing territory inside this zone meant the Japanese mainland itself was within range of devastating strategic bombing.
So based on this defensive line, where did Japan expect the next major U.S. attack?
They predicted the U.S. would logically attack the Philippines next. It seemed like the obvious move. It was a large, strategically significant target, ideal for the U.S. to mass the enormous forces and supplies they'd need for any potential mainland invasion later on.
But the U.S. didn't go for the Philippines first, did they?
No, they didn't. The source highlights the American target was actually the Mariana Islands, specifically Saipan.
And the reason?
Yeah.
Still about the bombers.
Primarily, yes. Still about those new, long-range B-29 superfortresses. The U.S. objective wasn't necessarily immediate invasion from Saipan, but securing forward bases for strategic bombing of the Japanese mainland. Saipan was perfectly located within B-29 range.
So Saipan became critically important for Japan.
Absolutely critical, because it lay within that carefully defined absolute national defense zone. Losing Saipan meant the homeland was directly exposed to B-29 raids. Japan felt they absolutely had to defend it at all costs.
How did they prepare?
Well, Japan poured significant resources into preparing Saipan's defense. They sent some 40,000 troops as part of their effort to recover and rebuild forces after the earlier losses. And they planned a major counteroffensive operation called AGO.
And here's where intelligence plays another huge role, right?
Oh, absolutely massive. Here's one of those stunning insights from the source. Disaster struck Japan before the battle for Saipan even began. Detailed documents outlining the entire AGO plan, ship movements, air coordination, everything fell into U.S., hands down in the Philippines. The source mentions an American force, likely anti-Japanese guerrillas operating there, captured a Japanese officer who was carrying the complete plan. The U.S. knew everything.
Unbelievable. So the U.S. could counter it before it started.
Precisely. Armed with this perfect intelligence, the U.S. executed a devastating preemptive countermove. Before even landing troops on Saipan, they launched massive air attacks on the surrounding island airfields, the ones that were key to Japan's AGO plan to use land-based aircraft as sort of unsinkable carriers. This neutralized Japan's planned air support and completely disrupted their whole defensive strategy before the main assault even began.
So the battle for Saipan started with the Japanese plan already compromised, their air support gone. They must have been at a huge disadvantage.
A severe disadvantage, yes. The U.S. landed an overwhelming force, the source says, around 70,000 troops against Japan's 40,000 defenders, whose plan was already blown. Supply lines were stretched thin, cut by U.S. naval superiority. And this is where that cultural element this source describes, the impact of Bushido, comes into really sharp focus on the battlefield.
How so?
Well, the interpretation of Bushido, prevalent at the time, often simplified as something like death is the essence of Bushido, combined with this intense loyalty to the emperor. It created powerful pressure against surrender. The source notes the deep societal shame associated with being captured. Soldiers knew their families back home could be ostracized. This fostered a desperate, never-surrender mindset within the military.
And that affected the fighting?
Profoundly. It was terrifying for the U.S. forces. Even when facing completely hopeless odds, Japanese troops fought with extreme ferocity, often literally to the last man. They inflicted maximum casualties through suicidal banzai charges. It made them an incredibly difficult and costly enemy to defeat, even when badly outnumbered and cut off.
The source contracts that ideal of a glorious death with the grim reality on the ground, doesn't it?
It does. It highlights the often futile, brutal nature of the fighting, resulting in tragic, arguably unnecessary loss of life on both sides, driven by this refusal to surrender.
And Saipan also involved civilians in a terrible way?
Yes. The battle for Saipan highlights the horrific reality for non-combatants caught in the middle. The source notes that because the U.S. advance was so rapid, only about half of the civilians on the island could be evacuated before the landing.
And the ones left behind?
They were placed in an absolutely impossible situation. The Japanese military, in some instances, actually ordered them to fight alongside the soldiers, sometimes armed only with sharpened sticks or farm tools.
That must have been devastating.
It had devastating consequences. While, wartime rules prohibit directly attacking civilians, when civilians are armed and actively fighting, U.S. forces couldn't easily distinguish them from soldiers in the heat of battle. This completely blurred the lines, putting innocent civilians directly in the line of fire during the intense, chaotic fighting. A real tragedy.
Okay, moving relentlessly closer to the Japanese mainland now. We reach the absolutely hellish Battle of Iwo Jima.
Iwo Jima, yeah. A small island, just volcanic rock, really.
Right.
But strategically absolutely critical for both sides at that stage of the war.
Why so critical?
For the U.S., it was desperately needed as a forward base for their B-29 bombers. It was vital for refueling on the long, dangerous runs to Japan, and also for basing the fighter escorts needed to protect the bombers. Plus, capturing it would deny Japan its use as an early radar warning station for incoming raids. For Japan, Iwo Jima was essential to delay the U.S. advance. Their goal wasn't victory. It was about inflicting maximum casualties, making the eventual cost of invading the mainland seem prohibitively high for the U.S., buying precious time.
And their defense strategy reflected that, not trying to win, but to inflict pain.
Exactly. Japan's strategy on Iwo Jima wasn't about holding ground indefinitely. The source is clear about that. It was delay and attrition. Their entire defense was centered around this incredibly extensive network of underground fortifications, bunkers, tunnels, caves dug deep into the volcanic rock, miles of tunnels.
And the U.S. didn't realize the extent of it initially.
No, they seriously underestimated it. U.S. aerial reconnaissance saw the surface, which looked relatively flat, and figured overwhelming numbers would quickly take the island. They completely missed the scale and complexity of the defensive network hidden underground.
So how did the Japanese fight from these tunnels?
Their tactics were designed to maximize U.S. casualties while preserving their own forces for as long as possible. They'd stay concealed underground during the day, then attack suddenly, often at night, from hidden tunnel entrances, inflict casualties, and then retreat back underground before U.S. counterattacks could fully respond. The source notes their night attacks were often eerily silent, unlike the expected loud banzai shouts, which further unnerved and surprised the U.S. forces.
So how did the U.S. deal with that? It sounds incredibly difficult.
It forced the U.S. into really brutal tactics to clear those defenses. They essentially had to destroy each hidden position individually. They used flamethrowers to clear tunnels, demolition charges to seal entrances, even gas attacks in some cases. The source describes it from the U.S. perspective as a brutal, one-sided slaughter. Not conventional combat, but relentlessly digging out an enemy who refused to come out or surrender.
What were conditions like for the Japanese defenders inside those tunnels?
Appalling. Absolutely horrific. Severe shortages of everything, food, water, ammunition, coupled with rampant disease spreading quickly in the cramped, unhygienic underground network. Heat, dust, darkness.
And this led to a breakdown within their own ranks.
Yes, the source describes how this desperation led to a kind of internal collapse, a breakdown of military order. There were forced reductions of personnel, wounded soldiers, sometimes sent out to die because they couldn't be cared for, others ordered on suicidal charges just to reduce the number of mouths to feed or conserve ammo. Survival measures became utterly desperate, including, the source implies, scavenging among corpses for anything usable.
That's grim.
Deeply grim. The psychological toll was immense. Order broke down completely in some areas. There was infighting. Even instances of soldiers killing their own comrades, sometimes maybe to conserve scarce resources like water, other times perhaps to prevent revealing the location of a hidden bunker if a wounded soldier cried out or was captured. It was a descent into utter chaos and brutality driven by sheer desperation.
The source mentions survivors didn't talk about this for a long time.
For decades, many didn't. There was deep shame, obviously, but also just the inability to articulate the horrific reality of what they'd experienced and done to survive.
Killing comrades.
Maybe hiding among bodies, the desperate scavenging. It took later generations asking difficult questions to really begin uncovering the full truth of what happened inside those tunnels on Iwo Jima.
It's a stark contrast, isn't it? The internal reality described by Japanese survivors versus the U.S. perspective of just fighting this incredibly relentless, dug-in enemy who refused to die.
Exactly. Both experiences were undeniably real. But the depths of the suffering and the complete breakdown of humanity within the Japanese forces were often hidden from the outside observer fighting them.
This intensity, this willingness to fight to the death, even when hopeless, it brings us back to that concept of total war and raises some really difficult questions about morality, especially concerning the strategic bombing campaign against Japan.
It does. As we discussed, total war inherently means civilian industrial capacity is essential for the military effort. To defeat the enemy requires cutting off that supply line, which inevitably means attacking the homeland where production happens.
But international law at the time generally prohibited attacking civilians directly.
Generally, yes. But there was always this exception for targets with clear military benefit, even if they were located within cities. And the source explains the really controversial justification the U.S. used for the wide-scale firebombing of Japanese cities, the Naisoku or cottage industry argument.
How did that work?
Well, the argument was that since some homes in Japan were involved in producing small military parts through piecework, doing assembly at home, then any home could potentially be a military target. This allowed them to justify attacks on largely residential areas, claiming they were hitting dispersed industrial capacity. It was a very broad, and many argue flawed, interpretation.
Were there other justifications offered?
Yes. The source mentions additional justifications cited by the U.S., including pointing to Japan's own earlier bombing of Chinese cities like Chongqing, basically implying Japan had little moral ground to complain when the same was done to them.
And the source mentions Curtis LeMay's perspective.
Yes, General Curtis LeMay, who commanded the B-29 bombing campaign. The source includes his stark perspective. Paraphrasing his view, the bombing wasn't driven by malice or cruelty, but was seen as a necessary, albeit horrific, means to end the war as quickly as possible and, crucially, save American lives that would be lost in a potential invasion. His logic, as presented, was that war itself inherently violates normal morality. The goal becomes to inflict enough damage on soldiers and the civilians supporting them to force the enemy government to stop fighting, quickly.
It lays bare a truly terrible calculation, doesn't it?
It does. The brutal logic to minimize one's own casualties, both military and civilian, you must maximize enemy casualties. And in a total war, that inevitably includes civilians who are part of the war machine, whether in factories or homes. This brutal logic, combined with the development of new technologies for mass destruction like napalm and the B-29s, led directly to the devastation of Japanese cities through firebombing.
So, after Iwo Jima, the next major step towards the mainland was Okinawa, the last big island battle.
Okinawa, yes. Located just off the coast of mainland Japan, it was the final critical hurdle for the U.S. invasion force and the absolute last major defensive stand for Japan outside the home islands.
What was Japan's initial plan for defending Okinawa?
Initially, the source tells us, their plan involved relying heavily on air defense. They started building numerous airfields across the island. Something like 18 were planned or under construction. And significantly, around 50,000 Okinawan civilians were drafted into forced labor before the battle even began, primarily for this airfield construction.
But did that plan hold?
No. As the overall war situation worsened dramatically for Japan, they realized effective air defense on that scale was no longer feasible given their aircraft and pilot losses. So the strategy shifted, or rather became confused. The source describes an internal debate within the Japanese command on Okinawa. What should the battle represent? Should it be a purely defensive sacrifice, just delaying the U.S. for as long as possible to buy time for mainland defenses? Or should it be a more offensive-minded battle, a glorious death type of engagement? Neither offered any real hope of victory, just different ways to lose. This lack of a unified plan led to localized decisions, sometimes based on what the source unsettlingly calls the aesthetics of dying.
How did the U.S. prepare for the invasion?
They prepared with a massive pre-invasion bombardment, even heavier than the one used at Iwo Jima, days of shelling from naval guns and relentless airstrikes to try and soften up the defenses before the troops landed.
And the battle itself?
Incredibly fierce. Some of the heaviest fighting and highest casualties of the entire Pacific War occurred on Okinawa. The source mentions around 60,000 U.S. casualties killed, wounded, missing. Japan inflicted significant delay and heavy losses, employing similar tactics to Iwo Jima with caves and tunnels, but they were ultimately overwhelmed by superior U.S. firepower and numbers. The Japanese command eventually retreated south on the island, cornered.
And the civilians. Okinawans were caught in this even worse than on Saipan.
Far worse.
Oh.
This is where the tragedy for Okinawan civilians reached absolutely horrific levels. Huge numbers were trapped between the retreating Japanese forces and the advancing Americans. The Japanese military spread extreme propaganda among the Okinawan population, instilling intense fear of the U.S. soldiers. They spread stories claiming Americans would rape, torture, and kill anyone captured, especially women and children. This was partly strategic to prevent civilians from surrendering and potentially giving information to the Americans. Civilians were often ordered to fight alongside the military, sometimes just with bamboo spears or farming tools. They were told death was preferable to capture.
And this propaganda worked.
Devastatingly so. Terrified civilians refused U.S. calls to surrender, even when trapped and starving. Some, tragically, even attacked U.S. soldiers with those primitive weapons, confusing the American troops who initially didn't understand why civilians were resisting. This led to harsher U.S. tactics to secure areas against what seemed like widespread civilian resistance.
And the source mentions the mass suicides, the Shudanjiketsu.
Yes, the most tragic outcome. Trapped civilians, completely believing the horrific propaganda, chose to kill themselves and their families rather than face capture. The source heartbreakingly describes parents killing their own children before taking their own lives, often using hand grenades provided by Japanese soldiers. It powerfully contrasts this with accounts from other caves where people happened to understand English surrender calls, realized they wouldn't be harmed, and surrendered safely. This highlights that the mass suicides were overwhelmingly driven by fear and propaganda, not some universal cultural imperative.
The source also mentions the student mobilization, like the Himayuri Student Corps.
Yes, another tragic aspect. Teenage students, mostly girls like the Himayuri Corps, were drafted as auxiliary nurses for the Japanese military. Conditions in the makeshift cave hospitals were beyond appalling, unhygienic, incredibly crowded, filled with the overwhelming stench of blood, pus, sweat, and death.
What was the medical reality like?
Horrific. With extremely limited supplies, amputations were often performed without any anesthesia. The source paints a truly grim picture. Doctors sawing off limbs while other students held the screaming patients down. Students were then tasked with disposing of the severed body parts outside the caves, often under heavy shell fire. Other duties, like carrying food and water back to the caves, machiage, under constant fire, were equally dangerous.
And their final fate.
Also tragic for many. As the Japanese lines collapsed, the students were often simply ordered to disperse, basically a death sentence, outside the relative safety of the caves. Many who stayed behind in the caves were killed when U.S. forces, after repeated surrender calls were ignored due to the instilled fear, eventually used flamethrowers or gas to clear the caves they believed still held resisting soldiers. The death rate for these young students and their teachers was incredibly high.
So even after Okinawa, after the firebombing, knowing an invasion was coming, surrender was still incredibly difficult for Japan. Why? What was the holdup?
The source highlights deep, paralyzing internal divisions among the Japanese leadership as the primary obstacle. There's just no consensus on what to do.
What were the main concerns?
Well, the Emperor Hirohito had a central concern: preserving the imperial system, the Kokutai. He feared that unconditional surrender, as demanded by the Allies, would lead to the abolition of the monarchy or even his own prosecution as a war criminal. So he wanted to end the war, yes, but primarily to save the imperial system, and ideally before total destruction eliminated any chance of negotiating that specific condition.
And the military, what was their stance?
The military leadership, by and large, wanted to continue fighting. The source describes their almost pathological relationship with war conflict, sustained their domestic political power, their influence, their entire reason for being, almost. They didn't want the war to end. Or, if it had to end, many favored one last massive suicidal battle, Ichigeki-ko-Iran, on the mainland. The idea was to inflict such horrific casualties on the invading U.S. forces that America might offer slightly better surrender terms, perhaps preserving the military's honor or structure.
So deadlock, how did they try to break it? Mediation.
Realizing that direct negotiation with the U.S., which kept demanding unconditional surrender and never mentioned the emperor's fate, was too risky for the imperial system. Some Japanese leaders desperately sought a third-party mediator, someone to negotiate terms that might protect the emperor.
And who did they choose?
Tragically, they pinned their hopes on the USSR, the Soviet Union. They believed the Soviet-Japanese Neutrality Pact, which was still technically in effect, and the fact the Soviets were allied with the U.S., made them a suitable go-between. They hoped Stalin could broker a deal.
But the source says Japan was unaware of something crucial.
Devastatingly unaware. They didn't know about a secret agreement made months earlier at the Yalta Conference, where Stalin had promised Roosevelt and Churchill that the USSR would enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's defeat. The Soviets had absolutely no intention of mediating. They intended to attack and grab territory, like Manchuria and the Coral Islands, for themselves. Japan's hopes for mediation were based on a completely false, betrayed premise.
And into this stalled situation came the Potsdam Declaration.
Yes. The Allied ultimatum issued in late July 1945, unconditional surrender or face prompt and utter destruction. It notably made no mention of the emperor's future status.
And Japan's reaction
was mokusatsu. This is often translated as to ignore or treat with silent contempt. The source explains the difficult position this put the government in. Accepting unconditional surrender risked the emperor's fate, which was unacceptable to many. Outright rejecting it risked a military coup from hardliners who wanted to fight on. So they chose ambiguity, delay, hoping perhaps for that Soviet mediation, which was never going to happen. This delay, this mokusatsu, proved utterly catastrophic.
because it led directly to the atomic bombs.
It certainly gave the U.S. the justification they felt they needed. With Japan effectively ignoring the Potsdam Ultimatum and the internal deadlock persisting, the U.S. proceeded with dropping the atomic bombs. The primary stated reasons for their use, the source explains, were pretty clear. End the war as quickly as possible without launching a massively costly mainland invasion, which was projected to cause hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of American casualties, and of course, force Japan's prompt surrender after the mokusatsu response.
But the source also mentions other secondary reasons that are debated.
Yes, it does. Secondary reasons often debated by historians include demonstrating the terrifying power of this new weapon to the Soviet Union, who were rapidly becoming post-war rivals, shaping the post-war world order. And also, grimly, gathering data on the actual effects of atomic bombs on cities and human populations.
How did they choose the targets?
Well, the U.S. officially cited military justifications to align with international law concepts. Hiroshima was described as a major military headquarters and depot. Kokura and Niigata had significant arms factories. Kyoto, the ancient capital, was famously removed from the target list, partly to avoid destroying irreplaceable cultural heritage, but also perhaps with an eye towards post-war relations, avoiding excessive long-term anti-American resentment. Tokyo was already devastated by firebombing.
And that data collection angle, how did that influence targeting?
The source notes this point. Target cities like Hiroshima, Kokura, and Nagasaki were intentionally avoided during the preceding conventional firebombing raids. This was likely done to get clearer data on the specific destructive effects of the atomic bombs themselves, without damage from previous raids confusing the analysis. Instruments were even dropped alongside the bombs to measure blast effects, heat, radiation, and the use of two different bomb types, the uranium bomb, Little Boy, on Hiroshima, and the plutonium bomb, Fat Man, on Nagasaki, also suggests a comparative data collection aspect.
So Hiroshima was bombed on August 6th. Massive destruction, huge civilian casualties.
Unprecedented destruction, yes.
But Japan still didn't surrender immediately.
No. And this is a crucial point the source makes. Even after the shock and horror of Hiroshima, the internal divisions and debate within the Japanese leadership continued. The military hardliners still resisted.
So 3 days later, August 9th, Nagasaki.
Yes, August 9th. The second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The primary target that day was actually Kokura, but it was obscured by clouds or smoke, so the plane diverted to the secondary target, Nagasaki.
The timing, just 3 days apart. The source raises questions about that, doesn't it?
It does. It implicitly asks, Was 3 days really enough time for the Japanese government, dealing with the chaos, communication difficulties, and that deep internal deadlock, to fully process what had happened at Hiroshima and make a decision? Or was the rapid second bombing driven more by those other factors, wanting to demonstrate the U.S. had multiple bombs, not just a one-off weapon, perhaps wanting more data from the different bomb type, or simply wanting to shock Japan into surrendering immediately before the Soviets advanced further into Manchuria? It's a point historians still debate.
And then on the same day as the Nagasaki bombing, August 9th, the Soviets declared war and invaded Manchuria.
Exactly. The final nail in the coffin for Japan's hopes of a negotiated peace through Moscow. They were now facing destruction from the air by atomic bombs, an impending U.S. invasion, and a massive Soviet invasion from the mainland.
Yet still, the deadlock continued.
Unbelievably, yes. Even after 2 atomic bombs and the Soviet declaration of war, the debate among Japanese leaders continued. Surrender versus that final mainland battle, for slightly better terms. Both sides acknowledged defeat was inevitable, but they still argue bitterly over how to lose.
How did it finally break?
The source describes how the deadlock was finally broken at an imperial conference, a meeting of the top leaders with the emperor. The military leaders still argued for fighting on, the civilian leaders argued for accepting Potsdam. The vote was split.
So the emperor had to intervene.
Yes, Emperor Hirohito intervened, making the final decisive choice. The source relays his justification. He said he couldn't bear to see the nation destroyed any further, the people suffering more death and destruction. The ability to continue fighting, he declared, was lost.
And his condition?
His decision was to accept the Potsdam terms, the Allied ultimatum, but only on the condition that the declaration does not comprise any demand which prejudices the prerogatives of His Majesty as a sovereign ruler. Basically, the imperial system had to be preserved.
And this led to the surrender broadcast.
Yes, it led to the unprecedented moment of the surrender broadcast, the Gyokunhoso, on August 15th, where the emperor spoke directly to his people via radio for the first time ever. His voice was high-pitched, the language formal and difficult for many to understand.
What was the message?
The source describes the message as lamenting the war's outcome, acknowledging the suffering of the people and the sacrifices of the military, praising the people's efforts, and urging them to endure the unendurable, unite, and have hope for rebuilding the nation. The source also offers a bit of historical reflection here, noting a potential perceived contradiction between the emperor's earlier actions and statements, which seemed supportive of the war effort, even questioning withdrawal from Guadalcanal due to losses, and this later message justifying surrender by lamenting destruction. It suggests the public at the time didn't have the full context of the internal struggles and earlier statements that historians know now.
So, looking back at all of that, the decisions, the battles, the immense human cost, the internal politics, why was this war so incredibly hard to stop once it got going?
Well, the source really distills it down to a complex, tragic interplay of factors. Internally, you had those deep, paralyzing political and military divisions in Japan. The civilian government increasingly wanted to end the war, especially to save the imperial system, but they constantly clashed with the military leadership, whose power, prestige, and worldview were tied to continuing the fight, clinging to that hope of a final honor-saving battle.
And the external factors?
Externally, major factors blocked any timely resolution. The strict U.S. demand for unconditional surrender without explicitly guaranteeing the emperor's safety initially left the Japanese moderates with little room to maneuver against the hardliners. And then, crucially, Japan's chosen mediator, the USSR, wasn't a mediator at all, but was secretly planning its own attack, actively deceiving Japan. There was no honest broker available.
And layered over all that was the culture.
Yes. Overlaying all of this was that deeply ingrained, never surrender mindset, fueled by the prevalent, perhaps distorted, interpretation of Bushido, making it culturally and institutionally incredibly difficult for the military leadership and even many soldiers to accept or even contemplate defeat until the situation was utterly catastrophic.
So the consequence of all this delay, this inability to make a decision.
The tragic consequence of this inability to make a timely, decisive decision, of this agonizing delay, was just immense, wasn't it? It led directly to the continued devastating conventional bombing, the horrific firebombing of city after city, and ultimately the use of the 2 atomic bombs, costing countless innocent civilian lives that might potentially have been saved had surrender come even a few weeks or months sooner.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting though. When you look at that horrific cost, the sheer number of lives lost just because of the inability to stop the momentum once it had started,
Yeah. It raises a really important, maybe timeless question, doesn't it? The source ends by emphasizing that understanding how wars start, and crucially, how they become so incredibly difficult, seemingly impossible to stop once they gain momentum, is absolutely vital. It strongly suggests that preventing such devastation in the future requires individuals, maybe leaders, maybe ordinary people, to have the courage to speak out against actions that are pushing towards conflict before the momentum builds, before it becomes too late to stop that terrible cascade of consequences.
So reflecting on all this, what does this deep dive into the Pacific War, into its causes and its agonizing end, mean for us today? What parts of this history resonate when we look at rising tensions or difficult decisions being made in the present that could potentially lead us down a similarly dangerous path? That's definitely something to think about long after this deep dive is over.